In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Well, the hymn we sung just before the gospel has always been a favorite of mine, too. I'm always brought back, though, not to my own childhood, but to my parenthood when my children were young. Because every time we sang this one in church, they changed the words to the second verse. The second verse goes, and one was a soldier, and one was a priest, and one was slain by a fierce wild beast. They changed it to one was a soldier, and one was a beast, and you can figure out what the rest of it went. They always thought that was hilarious. Well, today is a day that has been set aside for the celebration of All Saints. It's not one of the original feast days of the church. Is kind of a Johnny-come-lately, like Christmas. And in the same way, the timing of it was to cover a pagan festival. Now, we still celebrate that pagan festival. We did it Friday night. You may be familiar with that, Halloween. But the Celtic world, this was a festival called Samhain. It looks like it's spelled Samhain. They pronounce it Samhain. But it comes exactly at the midpoint between the fall equinox and the winter solstice. And it marks the beginning of the darkest period of the year, which goes from November 1st to February 1st, the darkest part of the year. And the Celts believed that it was on that night of Samhain that the forces of darkness and evil and the spirits and the fairies would come out and would rule in this period of darkness. And so they lit fires in the night and all sorts of things to ward off. So that kind of made sense in a way to redo this as a Christian holiday to celebrate what we've all been given already as God's children, as the saints of God, that we no longer have to fear the forces of darkness because we already have the kingdom of heaven. We already are God's children. Now, that was the message. It was a great idea, and it still is. I think part of the problem that we have with sainthood in general is the way that we've used it in our culture in terms of saints are sort of like Batman and Superman. There's something we could never attain to. They are so great and wonderful. I knew one priest friend who used to say that most people out there think of themselves as spiritual roadkill. We'll never be saints, we think. And yet, sainthood, it's a French word, it just means holy. And to be holy was not to be perfect. To be, as going back to last week when we were reading the holiness code of Leviticus, it begins with these words. God said to the people of Israel, "You shall be holy because I am holy." We're saints because we belong to God. Only reason why. We're not saints because we're perfect. We should try, but we're saints because we belong to God. We are God's people. And God has invited everyone to have this opportunity. Now, not everybody does, but the invitation is universal. I can remember when I was a teenager, and I went into somebody's home in a little town in New Mexico, and the woman started telling me that only 144,000 people were going to go to heaven. And I looked at her, like, are you crazy? But she pulled out her Bible and goes to the book of Revelation, and there it is, 144,000. Well, it is there. And that's the part just before where we picked up in the first reading. And of course, Revelation is not reality. It's a vision. And everything in it means something symbolic. In fact, Bruce Metzger, one of the great New Testament scholars of the last century, used to pound his fist on the desk when talking about the revelation of John. He says, it doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. But the 144,000 is 12 times 12,000, and it was the perfect completeness of Israel. That's what it stood for. It stood for all of Israel, and then, quote, this multitude that no one could number from every language, people, and nation from the whole world. Everybody is invited into God's kingdom. We say yes by getting wet. We say yes by baptism. Baptism establishes that bond, and in baptism, we are adopted as God's children. And then, as now, when someone is adopted, they become a full member of the family with all the rights and privileges of a naturally born child. We are God's children. That's what the writer of John, of Epistle 1 John is saying. That's who we are now. We're not who we used to be. We're God's children now. And we've yet to see what we're fully going to be. That will happen at some point when all of God's kingdom is fully revealed. But already, we are fully God's children. We are part of the family. Now, being the child of God, being a saint, is wonderful, and yet it's not always easy. And that's what both the first and the last lessons were talking about. When the angel asked John in the vision of Revelation, well, who are all these people standing before the throne of God? And John replies, you're the one who knows. So he tells them, and these are the ones who have come through the great ordeal. And they've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Being Christian isn't being one of God's children. Being a saint is not always easy. Sometimes it is an ordeal. I think sometimes it's an ordeal just by what we have to put up with in church sometimes. But it's not always easy. And we can be persecuted, and we can lose things, including our lives, and yet we gain so much more. And the Beatitudes are all about that paradoxical nature of sainthood. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you go out, if you were to walk out here and find a really poor person, I know we're not, but find one and say, what is the blessing of being poor? They'd probably look at you like you had two heads. There's no real blessing to being poor. It's hard. You wonder where you're going to eat your next meal. And yet, to be poor in spirit, to love the poor, is a blessing. To mourn, no one likes to mourn, and yet to be in that state is a blessing. To be hungry for righteousness is a blessing. In all of these ways, it seems paradoxical, and yet it's a blessing. The word blessed probably, because Jesus, of course, did not speak Greek. In the original that we have here, the word is a Greek word, makarios, which means happy or fortunate. And it's funny enough to think about happy is the poor person or the hungry person, or fortunate because it's paradoxical. But it's probably the Hebrew word that's behind it that Jesus would have used was ashar, which really has in a sense of being in the right place, doing the right thing. And that way we are happy and fortunate when we are where we're supposed to be and we're doing what we're supposed to do. But it's not the sort of giggly happy type of thing. I think maybe the best way to really think about how this is to think of some time where we really wanted something that really wasn't worth what we put into it. And it could be all kinds of things, from a shiny bicycle to a Mercedes or whatever it is. I've just got to have this. I've just got to have this. And then you finally get it and you go, It's because it really wasn't worth that. We may put everything we have into having a thing, achieving something. They're all good things. But when we do what we were created to do, when we achieve being the person that God has called us to be, that's when the real deep joy arrives. That's when we really experience it. And that's why Jesus could say this. Being a saint, following God's will is not easy, but it's always worth it. And the joy we get from serving God, from loving God and loving our neighbors and being part of that is worth more than anything else we could ever attain in our lives. That's the blessedness, the happiness. And we are all already there. We are already God's children. We are already God's saints through our baptism. And all we are called to do is to live into the truth of what that really is. We may hear, and we will hear, a million messages telling us that salvation is something else. In fact, with the election 2 days away, we're probably going to be pummeled with it for 2 more days. But we are really saved through the one who has already reached out and loved us and adopted us and called us his own. Amen.